Hey everybody, welcome to the channel. This video is going to feature a lot of dirt bike riding, but really it's about a plane crash. The B23 Dragon was first flown in July of 1939, but by 1943 the plane had already been replaced by better aircraft, so it never saw wartime combat, and instead it was relegated to secondary roles used for testing, training, transport and reconnaissance missions, that kind of thing. Well, it was January of 1943 when a B-23 flew into a bad winter storm and ended up crashing in a remote location in central Idaho. This is the story of that plane and its crew, along with some video of a dirt bike ride my friends and I took to visit the crash site nearly 80 years after it happened. The first of our many bridge crossings. On January 29th of 1943, the B-23 was returning to its home base, which was in Tacoma, Washington. The crew of 8 had been doing some testing in Nevada, and they were traveling roughly northwest from Nevada over Oregon back towards Tacoma when they flew into a winter storm. Visibility was low, and they got rerouted to the airfield in Burns, Oregon, but after circling for 20 minutes, they couldn't even see the airfield. So they decided to head northeast and land in Boise, Idaho instead, where they could wait out the storm. But somehow they ended up way off course. They were still in Idaho, but about 120 miles north of Boise. With heavy ice buildup on the wings and the cockpit windows, the pilot, Lieutenant Robert Orr, began looking for a place to land. But that part of Idaho is a remote and rugged place. It's about a mile in elevation with endless mountains, and in the winter the snow just keeps accumulating and doesn't melt before spring. The hilly terrain and the conditions made it really difficult to find a place to land. The crew considered their options, and they had decided to parachute from the plane. But just then they saw what they thought was a field below. It turned out to be Loon Lake. It was frozen over and covered with snow. Either way, they had a potential landing zone. So they scrapped the plan to bail, and they decided to try to land in the clearing instead. But because of frozen flaps and too much airspeed, the first attempt to get the plane down failed. Now, as if they needed something else to go wrong, about that time the right engine caught fire. In spite of the challenges, Orr was able to turn the plane around and make a second pass, this time flying north to south. But again, they had too much airspeed, and he failed to land the plane on the lake. Instead, they overshot the lake and went down in the trees on the south shore. Both wings were sheared off, but the plane finally hit the ground, belly down in the deep snow. Fortunately, all 8 of the crew members survived the crash, but not all of them were unscathed. Sergeant Hoover suffered several injuries, breaking his foot, a wrist, and a kneecap. The pilot's hand hit the instrument panel on impact and was cut badly. Amazingly, the other 6 were not injured at all. Once on the ground, the crew built crude shelters, digging holes in the snow and covering them with parts from the airplane. They also built a fire, and then they waited several days. But there was no sign of rescue. Well, that's because the AAF assumed the plane had gone down in Oregon, because that's where the plane was when they sent the last radio transmission. On February 1st, the radio operator was able to send just one message in Morse code, stating their tail number and saying that they were all still alive. And he provided a valuable clue that they were at the south end of a lake. But he added that they were near Boise, which really wasn't very accurate, as they were about 120 miles north of that. The next day, the crew decided that some of the men should set off on foot and try to find help. They chose 3 of the fittest crew members. Their names were Pruitt, Schermerhorn, and Freeborg, and those 3 set off on February 3rd. Finding the Secesh River just to the east, they followed that river downstream, which happens to be southward. They were hoping to find civilization or even anyone who could help. They were armed with a shotgun, but they didn't have much else, and they certainly weren't prepared for slogging through waist-deep snow. Really, they were just dressed in their aviators' outfits. They reportedly walked for 20 hours the first day, but evidently they only made it about 2 miles. They spent another 8 days struggling through that waist-deep snow before they came to a cabin. It was a place that was called Slick Rock Browns. But imagine how disappointing it was to find that Slick Rock Browns had no phone there. Fortunately, they did find some food, and better yet, a map on the wall. Using that map, they determined their position and the location of the Lake Fork Ranger Station, where they thought maybe they'd find a phone. If not, at least they knew the route to get to the town of McCall, but that was still miles to their southwest. The men stayed at the cabin and rested for 3 days before setting off again. The Army Air Forces had over 70 planes searching around the clock at one point, but they were having no luck. And eventually they called off the search after 11 days. But in central Idaho, a bush pilot named Penn Storr had also been looking for the wreck. He was flying a different route over the area every day and paying extra attention when he flew around lakes. On February 13th, Storr noticed some trees near Loon Lake that were missing their tops, and then he spotted the wreckage. Storr was unable to land that day because his plane had no skis, but the next day, with skis installed on the plane, he returned, and 16 days after the crash, all 5 crewmen who had stayed at the lake were rescued. As for the 3 men who had set off to find help, they hiked to the summit at a place called Lick Creek, but at the top they saw nothing but mountains for miles in every direction. Freeborg described it as the most disappointing sight I had ever hoped to see. But they kept pushing south. They didn't really have a choice. And several miles later, they found an old CCC camp building. Sergeant Pruitt's feet were frozen and he couldn't go any further, so Schermerhorn and Freeborg left him there and continued another 5 miles, reaching the Lake Fork Ranger Station on February 16th, 2 days after their crewmates at the lake had been rescued. At the station, they found a telephone and were finally able to call out for help. The next morning, forest rangers came and rescued Schermerhorn and Freeborg, then went off to find Pruitt. So the story has a happy ending, as all 8 of the crewmen survived.
But some 80 years after that incident, a lot of that plane still remains at Loon Lake. And so that's today's adventure. We are riding our bikes out to the lake, and then we're going to have to hike about a mile to get to the bomber crash site. We started this ride at the Ruby Meadows Trailhead, which is just across from the Bergdorf Road. And we headed south towards Loon Lake. And we're about 12, 13 miles into the ride.
So we left the bikes and now we're hiking in the rest of the way.
super cold. So,
Right to there.
back to the bikes and back on the trail.
Although we rode in and out on the Ruby Meadows Trail, the shorter route to Loon Lake is to start at the Loon Creek Trailhead, which is near the Chinook campground just north and east of Loon Lake. I believe it's about 9 miles from that trailhead to the crash site. As for the wreckage of the plane, what remains of the B-23 can be found about 150 yards from the water on the south shore of the lake.
It's amazing to think of the 2 weeks that those guys endured, eating woodpeckers and squirrels and stuff. Leaving Ruby Meadows Trail and back onto the wagon road for a couple miles back to our campsite.
To wrap this up, I just want to say that the whole experience was really interesting, from first learning about the story to going there to see it for ourselves. The riding was pretty fun too, with several miles of forest roads followed by some easy single track. When you get to the lake, it is possible to ride the trail on the western shore, but just be aware it's an intermediate trail and has a few challenging sections where all of us had to get off and sometimes help each other get through. More advanced riders probably won't have much trouble with that section though. Be aware that the last half mile or so to the crash site has to be done on foot, and you have to cross Loon Creek on the way. It's only about knee deep, but it was pretty cold even on a warm September day. If you go, just be prepared to get a little wet. That's all I got for this video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.